Nita had a way of making herself small in rooms where she felt unwelcome. She had learned it young, the way you learn most useful survival skills, not from instruction, but from necessity. She was the kind of person who arrived at parties and spent the first 20 minutes finding the edges of things, mapping the space, figuring out where she fit before committing to a position. It wasn't shyness exactly. She was a nurse. She spent 12-hour shifts managing emergencies, talking to frightened people, making quick calls under pressure that other people couldn't make. Shy was not the word. Careful was closer. Deliberate. She had not, in the beginning, felt unwelcome in the Malik family. That was the thing she turned over sometimes in the year that followed, trying to locate the point where she should have known. Because it hadn't started with hostility. It had started with warmth, or something that wore warmth convincingly enough that she hadn't questioned it. Faraka's mother, Sadia, had embraced her almost literally from the first meeting. A small, energetic woman who cooked with the intensity of someone who believed food was a primary love language, and whose first Saturday dinners were genuinely something Nita had looked forward to. The table was always too full. There was always more than anyone could finish. There was always the sense, at Sadia's table, that you were being cared for. She'd wanted to belong to that. She'd been honest with herself about that, even later. She'd grown up in a quieter house, a smaller family, a mother who loved her but expressed it in more restrained ways. The abundance of the Malik household, the noise, the food, the physical affection, the way everyone talked over each other without it being unkind, had felt, in the early years of her marriage, like something she was being let into. A warmth she was being invited to share. She had not looked closely enough at the edges. Farak. She needed to place him properly in the story, because it was easy, in retrospect, to flatten him into a villain, and the truth was more complicated and in some ways more painful than that. She had loved him. That mattered. Not as a caveat or a softening, just as fact. She had loved him for 4 years before they married, and for 4 years inside the marriage, and the love had been real in the ways that real love is. Imperfect, occasionally frustrating, built on the accumulation of ordinary moments rather than dramatic declarations. He was good at his job. They both worked at the same hospital, he in radiology, she in the medical ward, and she had always respected that about him. He was patient with difficult patients. He had a dry sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments. He remembered things she mentioned in passing and brought them up weeks later in ways that made her feel seen. She had felt seen by him. That was what she'd thought. The infertility had been a long shadow over the last 2 years of the marriage. Not devastating in the way she'd feared. They'd talked about it, both of them, with a directness that had surprised her, and the idea of adoption had been on the table since the first specialist visit. But it had changed something in the atmosphere of the marriage nonetheless. There was a weight to it that they carried separately, even when they tried to carry it together. She'd catch him looking at the children of their colleagues, with an expression she couldn't fully read. She'd find herself, sometimes, going through the motions of intimacy while her mind was somewhere far away, calculating and worrying and grieving a version of their future she'd had to let go. She'd talked to Sadia about it once. Carefully, without too much detail. Sadia had taken her hand and said, "It will work out, whatever form it takes." Nita had felt, in that moment, genuinely held. She thought about that later. The particular cruelty of it. Dina was the part of the Malik family that Nita had struggled, from the beginning, to find a footing with. She was 3 years younger than Farak, 25 at the time of the marriage, and she had the particular quality of someone who had grown up as the most vivid person in any room they occupied and had simply never been given reason to adjust to the existence of competition. She was beautiful in an attention-seeking way, not just in her appearance, but in her manner, the way she angled herself in conversations, the way she dressed for family dinners as though the occasion might be photographed. She'd had 4 jobs in the past 6 months. Each one had ended with a variation of the same story. Toxic environment, unreasonable management, colleagues who didn't appreciate her. She had a particular talent for spending money she didn't earn on things that reinforced the story she told about herself. None of that, on its own, would have been Nita's problem. She'd known people like Dina before. The world had a generous supply of them, and most of them were survivable at family dinners. What made Dina different was Farrick. They had been close since childhood. She understood that. Siblings could be close. The closeness itself wasn't the thing that made Nita's skin tighten when she tried to examine it. It was the specific texture of the closeness. The way Dina positioned herself, physically between Nita and Farrick at every family gathering. Not dramatically, not in a way you could point to and name, but consistently as though she were drawn by a compass that only she could feel. The way she interrupted Nita mid-sentence to direct a question at Farrick. The way she would touch his arm when she was speaking to him, possessively, as though the contact were a claim. And the look. There was a particular look that Dina gave Nita, only when Farrick wasn't watching, only in the gaps between one moment and the next, that Nita had tried to describe to herself and kept failing to find the right word for. It wasn't hatred. It was something more personal than hatred. It was the look of someone who considered you an intrusion. She tried to talk to Farrick about it 3 separate times. The first time, he'd been tired from a long shift, and she'd chosen the wrong moment, and he'd been dismissive in the way of someone who didn't have bandwidth. She'd let it go. The second time had been more deliberate. She'd waited for a calm evening, no distractions, and she tried to describe what she was noticing specifically and without accusation. He'd listened. Then he'd said, "You're overthinking it. You know how she is with everyone. She's just expressive. She doesn't mean anything by it." Nita had sat with that. Turn it over. Was she overthinking it? She was, by her own nature, a careful observer of people. She noticed things. Nursing had sharpened that. The ability to read a room, to catch the small signal in the body language that indicated something not yet named. Was it possible she was applying that professional hypervigilance to a family dynamic that was simply unfamiliar to her? Was it insecurity? She'd asked herself that. Was she threatened by the closeness between a man and his sister because her own family was quieter, more contained, less physically demonstrative? Maybe. She tried to believe that. The third conversation had been after a Sunday dinner at the Malik house, maybe 2 months before everything fell apart. Dina had spent the evening placing herself in front of Nita with a precision that felt, by that point, deliberate. When Farrick had leaned over to kiss Nita's cheek at the table, a small, ordinary gesture, Dina had looked at Nita with an expression that stopped her breath for a second. It was there and gone. Nobody else saw it. But Nita saw it, and it sat in her chest for the rest of the evening like a swallowed stone. In the car on the way home, she tried once more to name what she was feeling. Farrick had said, gently but with a firmness that closed the door, "You're being insecure, Nita. She's my sister. I need you to trust me on this." She looked out the window and said nothing. She had trusted him. That was the entire problem. The Tuesday she came home early was not supposed to be a significant day. She'd gone to work feeling slightly off, a low-grade dizziness she'd attributed to poor sleep and not enough water. She told herself she'd push through, the way healthcare workers tell themselves every shift, the calculus of personal wellness against professional obligation running constantly in the background. She'd made it to the ward, taken her hand over, checked on 2 patients, and then the floor had tilted in a way that wasn't metaphorical. She'd grabbed the nurse's station counter, and her colleague Selena had been there immediately. Hand on her arm, the institutional plastic cup of water appearing, as if conjured. "Go home," Selena had said. "I've got you covered." Selena had driven her. Nita had been too lightheaded to argue, and besides had taken the bus that morning because Farrick had the car. He'd mentioned the day before that he had the day off and was planning to meet some university friends he hadn't seen in a while, a group of 4 who'd stayed in loose contact through a WhatsApp group that occasionally sparked into life. She'd told him to enjoy it. She'd told him she'd be home by 7. She'd thought nothing of it. Selena dropped her at the front of the house, and Nita thanked her twice and went inside. The house was quiet in the specific way of an empty house, a particular quality of stillness that she registered without thinking about it. She showered, changed, took something for the dizziness, and ate a small amount that she didn't have appetite for but knew she needed. Then she drifted in the directionless way of someone too unwell to concentrate but not unwell enough to sleep, out to the back garden. The garden was small and had been her project. Farrick liked the idea of it, but not the work. He'd said so cheerfully, the way he said most things, and she'd taken ownership of it without resentment. There was something she found genuinely calming about it. The physical simplicity of it. The dirt under her fingernails, and the resistance of roots, and the visible result of effort. She'd lost herself in it the way you lose yourself when you've been carrying things you haven't set down, the way physical work absorbs the mind without requiring it. She looked up at some point, and the afternoon had moved significantly further than she'd realized. Nearly 4 o'clock. She went back inside, washing her hands at the kitchen sink, watching the garden soil run off her fingers in thin brown rivulets. She was looking out the window above the sink at the garden, still thinking about nothing much, when her peripheral vision registered something at the edge of her attention. She turned toward the hallway. Farrak's shoes. His good ones, the brown leather pair he wore when he was seeing people, not the old ones he wore around the house. They were placed neatly inside the door, as he always placed them, heels together, toes pointing outward. She stood very still. Her eyes moved to the coat rack. A jacket. Cream-colored, fitted, the kind with the hardware on the pockets that served no purpose except to mark its price. She knew that jacket. She had seen that jacket at the last 3 family dinners, worn with the studied casualness of someone who needed you to notice what they were wearing. Dina's jacket. Nita turned off the tap. She dried her hands slowly on the kitchen towel, each movement deliberate, her mind doing something she would later only be able to describe as a kind of calm reorganization. Like a filing cabinet being sorted with great efficiency while the rest of her stood back and watched. She registered the shoes. She registered the jacket. She registered the absence of any sound from the ground floor. She registered, then, that there was sound. From upstairs. Muffled, indistinct. The particular quality of sound from behind a closed door. She moved to the bottom of the stairs. She placed her foot on the first step. She went up slowly, not because she was sneaking, but because her legs had taken on a strange quality, as though the signals from her brain were being slightly delayed. The landing. The bedroom door, pulled not quite closed, a thin strip of dim afternoon light coming through the gap of the frame. She approached it from the side, the way she'd once moved toward a patient's room when she wasn't certain what she'd find. She looked through the gap. The first thing she registered was the bed, their bed, the duvet they'd chosen together to shop on a Saturday afternoon, the pillows that had her indentation and his side-by-side. She registered the 2 figures on it. She registered Farrak's profile, his hand moving to the face of the woman beside him. She registered the woman's hand at the back of his neck, fingers threaded into his hair. She stood there for what felt like an extended, surreal interval of time, but was probably less than 3 minutes. Then something in her that had been suspended simply settled. She took out her phone. Her hands were steady. That surprised her later. She would have expected them to shake. They didn't. She filmed for perhaps 30 seconds, just enough. Then a photograph. She looked at the screen to check both were clear. They were. She pushed the door open. Farrak turned. The color left his face in a single, rapid drain, leaving something pale and terrible underneath. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. She watched him sit up, watched the guilt organize itself on his face in real time, and found herself strangely unmoved by it. Not cold, just clear. Clarity had arrived, and it had arrived as a kind of terrible gift. Dina turned. Dina smirked. That was the part Nita would return to most often in the months that followed. Not Farrak's pallor. Not the bedroom. Not the jacket on the coat rack. The smirk. There was something in it that communicated more clearly than anything that was said that afternoon that this had not been an accident, that it had not been weakness or confusion or a terrible lapse. It had been a choice, repeated and deliberate and in some way calculated. The smirk was a declaration. I knew what this was. I don't regret it. Nita told them to get out. She said it once, at a volume she hadn't known she was capable of, standing in the doorway of her own bedroom. They got out. She heard the front door close. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall opposite for a long time. The messages started around 6 that evening. Not from Farrak. He had gone, presumably to his parents' house, which was where the story was evidently being reshaped as it traveled. The messages came from his uncle, from 2 cousins she barely knew, from his father Tariq, and from Sadia. Sadia, who had held her hand at the kitchen table and told her things would work out in whatever form they took. The messages said variations of the same thing. That she had screamed at Dina, who had come to drop something off. That she had been jealous and irrational and had made a scene that had deeply upset the family. That she should be ashamed of herself. She read them without responding. She read them the way you read something in a language you know, but in which you're not quite fluent, checking your comprehension, making sure you were understanding correctly. She understood correctly. They had been told a story, a specific, detailed, preemptive story, the kind that gets told before the truth can arrive. She texted back only one person, Tariq, her father-in-law, whose number was in her phone from a single exchange a year ago about a surprise birthday dinner for Sadia. She asked him what he had been told. His reply came quickly. He said she had screamed at his daughter when Dina was only dropping something off for her. He said he expected better. He said she was a horrible woman. She read it. Then she sent him the video and the photograph. She put her phone face down on the kitchen counter. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table, the one she'd bought herself, the one with no wobble, the one that was entirely hers. She drank the tea slowly and watched the evening light change on the garden outside. She heard her phone buzz once, then several times in quick succession. She didn't pick it up. The divorce was not complicated in the end. She had the video. She had the photograph. She had a lawyer who was thorough and unbothered and who had seen everything. The marriage, financially, was reasonably simple to separate. They kept mostly separate accounts, the habit of two people who'd both been independent before they merged, and the house was rented, so there was no property to contest. The process took 7 months from filing to finalization. Nita moved into a small flat 3 weeks after the discovery, taking only what was hers, leaving everything that was shared without argument. She was surprised by how much she didn't miss. She'd expected grief of a particular texture, the kind that follows the end of something you genuinely invested in, that arrives in waves and ambushes you in ordinary moments. There was some of that. She wouldn't pretend otherwise. There were evenings in the first 2 months where she sat with the specific weight of betrayal and felt it in a way that was almost physical, a heaviness in the chest that didn't entirely lift. She'd built something with Farrick. She believed in it. The loss of what she believed it to be was real, even if what it had actually been was something different. But underneath the grief, and persistent in a way she hadn't expected, was relief. The tightness she'd carried for 2 years, the managed discomfort of family dinners, the swallowed observations, the conversations that went nowhere, the nights where she'd lain awake examining herself for signs of insecurity that didn't actually exist. It lifted. She had not been wrong. She had not been paranoid. She had not been insecure. Her instincts, carefully observed and consistently dismissed, had been accurate in every particular. And there was something in that validation, cold comfort, perhaps, but real comfort nonetheless, that steadied her in the early months of being alone. She went back to work. She was good at her job, and her job was glad to have her back without distraction. She ran in the mornings. She spent a Saturday replanting her small balcony garden with the pots she'd taken from the house, and found the same absorption in the dirt and the roots and the visible results of effort. She called her mother more often. She ate properly and slept more than she had in years. She did not, for a long time, think very much about Tariq. He had texted, the evening she sent the video, a message that consisted of a single line. I am sorry. No explanation. No elaboration. She had read it and put the phone down and not replied. He had texted again 6 weeks later. She had seen his name on the screen and hesitated before opening it. He said that he had spoken to no one in the family, that what he had seen had not left him, that he did not know what she needed or wanted, but he wanted her to know that he believed her, and that what had happened was not something he could make sense of, and that he was ashamed of the messages sent to her that evening. She'd read it several times. She'd typed a reply, deleted it, typed another. In the end, she'd written, "Thank you for saying that." That's all. She hadn't expected him to respond to that. He did. The correspondence was tentative at first, fragmented, 2 or 3 messages exchanged, and then a gap of weeks before either of them reached back. He was not what she'd assumed he was during the marriage. She'd categorized him as cold, as the parent who didn't bother with her, as the silent reinforcement of Dina's contempt. Up close in text, he was something different. Reserved, yes. Precise. Someone who chose his words with the care of a person who'd learned that careless words cost things. He'd been in a marriage, he said eventually, that had been over for a long time before either of them had been honest about it. He'd stayed for the children. He wondered now about the shape of that decision. She hadn't offered easy absolution. She wasn't built that way. But she'd found herself interested. It crept up on her slowly, and she examined it without suppression, trying to be honest with herself about what it was and what it wasn't. It wasn't revenge. She checked for that, turned to feeling over looking for the dark edge of it, and it wasn't there. She didn't think about Farrick when she thought about Tarek. She didn't think about the symmetry of it or the irony. She thought about a man who had apologized without being asked, who had engaged without performance, who was sitting with the wreckage of his own family with a quietness that she recognized. They met for coffee 7 months after everything ended. She'd been nervous in the way of someone who hadn't been nervous in a long time. She arrived 5 minutes early and chose a table by the window and ordered something she didn't drink while she waited. He arrived exactly on time. He was taller than she remembered from family dinners, or perhaps she'd simply never looked at him directly enough to register his height. He sat down, and the conversation began with the careful register of two people who had corresponded at a distance and were now recalibrating for proximity. Within 20 minutes, the caution had loosened. Within an hour, she had laughed twice, genuinely. She drove home afterwards with the window down despite the cold and thought about what she was doing and whether it was wise, and concluded that wisdom was a reasonable aspiration, but not the only one. She was 28 years old. She had survived something that would have destroyed a less grounded person. She was sleeping well and working well and replanting her balcony with things that grew. She was allowed to be interested in someone, even if the someone was complicated, especially, perhaps, because the someone was complicated. A year on from the afternoon, she'd come home with garden dirt under her fingernails and found the world rearranged. Nita sat in her small flat on a Sunday morning with the particular quality of peace that comes not from the absence of complexity, but from having moved through it. She thought sometimes about the woman she'd been in the Malik family home, making herself small, doubting her own perception, having the same conversation 3 times about something she could see clearly and being told she was wrong. She thought about that woman with something close to tenderness. She had not been naive. She had been willing to question herself, which was different, and that quality was worth keeping even if the particular situation had abused it. She had learned the difference. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She looked at it. She smiled, small and private, and picked it up. She was, all things considered, doing just fine.